My name is Vivian, and I'm 62 years old. 3 weeks before my wedding, I stood in our kitchen and understood my fiancé's hands before my heart could catch up. I had been learning sign language quietly. He didn't know that. What he signed that night shattered everything I thought I knew about love and safety. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about family drama, quiet revenge, and emotional courage. I remember the sound of the refrigerator more than anything else. That low hum. Steady, ordinary, almost comforting. It was early evening, and the light coming through the kitchen window had turned soft and pale, the way it always did around dinner time. I was standing near the counter, pretending to read a grocery list on my phone, while my fiancé, Mark, leaned against the sink. He looked relaxed, too relaxed, one foot crossed over the other, shoulders loose, the kind of calm that comes from believing you are completely unseen. That's when his hands moved. At first, I didn't react, not because I didn't understand, but because my brain refused to accept what my eyes had just translated. I had spent months learning sign language in private, practicing every night after he went to bed, repeating gestures until my fingers ached. I never told him. I wanted it to be a small surprise one day, something thoughtful, something kind. What I saw in that moment was not kind. Mark wasn't speaking out loud. He didn't need to. His friend, Alan, was on speakerphone, laughing about something I hadn't been listening to. Mark rolled his eyes, turned slightly away from me, and signed slowly, clearly, without hesitation. She has no idea. My chest tightened, but I stayed still. Maybe I misread it. That happens when you're still learning, right? Doubt rushed in, trying to protect me. My hands went cold. My mouth felt dry. Then his hands moved again. Almost over. That's when my knees locked. I had learned enough by then to know there was no mistake. His signs were casual, confident, practiced. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't joking. He was communicating something he believed was completely private. I didn't look at him. I was afraid that if I did, he'd see it on my face. The shock, the fear, the way my world had just tilted sideways without warning. Instead, I stared at the list on my phone. Milk, bread, eggs. Words that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Alan's voice crackled through the speaker. "You still there, man?" "Yeah," Mark said out loud, warm and easy. "Just listening." Listening. The word landed like a cruel joke. I felt the room shrink. The walls didn't move, but the air did. It grew heavy, pressing against my chest. I focused on my breathing, counting silently the way I'd learned to do years ago when anxiety tried to take over. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow, controlled. Mark smiled at me then, the same smile I trusted for 4 years, the one that had convinced me I was safe, loved, chosen. "Viv," he said gently, "you want me to start dinner?" I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. As he turned back to the stove, his hands moved again, quick this time. Smaller, almost lazy, clueless. I swallowed hard. The betrayal didn't explode. It seeped, quiet and steady, like water through a crack in the ceiling. I felt it drip into every memory we shared, staining moments I had once held close. I thought back to why I had started learning sign language in the first place. It wasn't because of him. It was because of my neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly, a kind older woman who had lost her hearing years ago. We'd started chatting in the hallway, smiling and nodding, and one day she signed something to me. I didn't understand, but I wanted to, so I signed up for an online class. Just once a week at first, then more. I loved the quiet focus of it, the way communication didn't need sound to be powerful. It felt respectful, honest, Mark never asked why I spent so much time on my tablet at night with the volume low. He assumed I was playing games or watching shows. I let him think that. It didn't feel like a secret. Not then. Standing in the kitchen, that harmless decision suddenly felt like a lifeline. I replayed his signs in my head, making sure I hadn't imagined them. My teacher's voice echoed in my memory, reminding us to watch facial expressions, body language, context. All of it matched. My heart began to race, but my face stayed calm. I had lived long enough to know that reacting too quickly could make things worse. Years teach you that patience can be stronger than anger. Mark finished the call and set his phone down. He turned toward me, wiping his hands on a towel. "You okay?" he asked. "You look tired." I forced a small smile, just thinking about everything we still need to do before the wedding. His eyes softened, or at least they pretended to. "We'll be fine," he said. "You worry too much." There it was, another small thing that now felt sharp. I wondered how many times he dismissed my concerns while quietly believing I was foolish for having them. I stepped out of the kitchen and into the living room, needing space. The familiar couch, the framed photos, the throw blanket my sister had given us, all of it looked the same, yet none of it felt real anymore. I sat down slowly, my body heavy, like gravity had doubled without warning. This wasn't just about what he signed. It was about how easily he did it, how natural it seemed, how certain he was that I would never understand. I realized then that this wasn't a slip. It was a habit. The thought settled deep in my chest, uncomfortable and heavy. From the living room, I could see his reflection in the hallway mirror. He was humming softly as he moved around, completely at ease. I wondered how long he'd been carrying this version of himself alongside the one he showed me. I thought about the wedding invitations already sent, the dress hanging quietly in the spare room, the plans layered carefully on top of a truth I had just uncovered. My hands trembled, so I folded them together, pressing my fingers into my palms until the shaking stopped. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. One moment didn't define everything. I needed more clarity, more understanding. If I had learned anything in my 62 years, it was that assumptions could be dangerous, but so could denial. When Mark joined me on the couch, I leaned slightly away, without meaning to. He noticed. I saw it in his eyes. "Hey," he said, placing a hand on my knee. "What's wrong?" I looked at him then. Really looked. The lines near his eyes. The familiar shape of his mouth. The man I thought I knew. "Nothing," I said softly. "Just a long day." He squeezed my knee once and stood up again, accepting my answer without question. That hurt more than I expected. As he walked away, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Awareness. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. I had heard what he never meant me to understand. And the knowledge changed the air between us forever. I stayed quiet that night, not because I was weak, but because I was listening now. I stayed quiet that night, not because I was weak, but because I was listening now. The house felt different once that thought settled in. Not darker, not colder, just exposed. Like a room where the curtains had been pulled back without warning. Mark moved through our space the same way he always did, confident, familiar, unaware that the ground beneath him had shifted for me. I watched him longer than usual, not in a dramatic way, just small glances. The way his shoulders relaxed when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The way his smile appeared a second too late, like it had been practiced somewhere else before being brought out for me. When we went to bed, I lay on my side, facing the wall. He reached for me, resting his hand lightly on my back. It was a touch I used to find comforting. That night, It felt like a question I wasn't ready to answer. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind drifted backward without my permission, pulling up moments I had once brushed aside. Tiny things. Moments I had labeled as misunderstandings or stress or just how men are. Now, they lined up quietly, waiting their turn to be seen clearly. I remembered a dinner party from the year before. Nothing fancy, just neighbors and a few friends gathered around our old dining table. I had been telling a story, something simple, about getting lost on a road trip years ago. People were smiling, listening, except Mark. I recalled how he had glanced at Alan across the table and made a small, quick movement with his hand. I hadn't known what it meant then. I had laughed, thinking maybe it was a private joke or a habit I didn't understand. That night, lying awake, I replayed the gesture in my head. The angle of his wrist, the flick of his fingers. Dismissive. I felt my throat tighten. Another memory followed. A grocery store aisle, bright with fluorescent lights. I had been comparing prices, trying to stick to a budget. Mark had sighed loudly, shifted his weight, and made a subtle motion with his hands while looking past me, as if the shelves were more interesting than the conversation. I had apologized that day for taking too long, for being careful. I remembered how strange that felt afterward, like I had shrunk a little without meaning to. Now I wondered who that gesture had really been for. The next morning, I watched him make coffee. He hummed, poured creamer, checked his phone. At one point, he smirked at something on the screen and signed something quickly with one hand, the other still holding his mug. It was so natural for him that it almost looked unconscious. My heart skipped, but I kept my eyes on the window. I pretended to be lost in the view of our quiet street, where nothing ever seemed to happen. Inside, though, my thoughts were loud. Was this new, or had I simply been blind? I thought about the times he'd told stories about me to others while I stood nearby, how he'd exaggerate my forgetfulness, laugh about my habits, frame everything as harmless humor. People would laugh. I would smile along, not wanting to seem sensitive. I told myself that couples tease, that love includes laughter. But now, that laughter echoed differently in my ears. Later that day, we drove to run errands. I offered to drive, and he agreed, scrolling on his phone as I navigated familiar roads. At a stoplight, I glanced over and saw his hands moving again, low near his lap, subtle enough that anyone else would miss it. I felt a sharp pull in my chest. I kept my eyes on the road, my grip steady on the steering wheel. The light turned green. Life moved forward, as it always did, even when something inside you wanted to stop. At the hardware store, he walked a few steps ahead of me, pointing out items we didn't really need. When I asked a question, he answered without looking back, his voice polite but distant. A small thing, a very small thing, but small things add up. I remembered a time months earlier when I had brought up a concern about finances, wedding costs, retirement plans, real-life matters that come with age and experience. He had listened, nodded, then later told me I worried too much, that I should relax and trust him. Trust. The word felt heavy now. That afternoon, I stopped by Mrs. Donnelly's apartment. She was sitting by the window, sunlight warming her face. She smiled when she saw me and signed a greeting. Her hands moved slowly, carefully, each motion filled with intention. Being around her always made me feel calm, seen, respected. As we chatted, I found myself watching her expressions more closely than usual. The honesty in her communication, the absence of hidden meaning. She signed what she felt, nothing more, nothing less. When I left, I stood in the hallway for a moment longer than necessary, leaning against the cool wall. The contrast between her openness and Mark's secrecy felt sharp. Back inside our apartment, Mark was on the phone again, laughing, comfortable. He didn't notice me come in right away. His hands moved as he spoke, punctuating his words with gestures that now felt loaded with meaning. I didn't catch every sign. Some were too quick, some too low, but the tone was familiar, casual, confident. That night, over dinner, he asked me about my day. His voice was warm, his eyes attentive. Anyone watching would have seen a caring partner. I answered honestly, but simply. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something fragile. "You're quiet," he said, studying me. "Just thinking," I replied. He nodded, accepting that again. A pattern I hadn't noticed before. How easily he accepted my silence. How rarely he pushed to understand it. As the days passed, I started noticing more. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just enough to make it impossible to ignore. The way he'd correct me gently in public, but speak sharply in private. The way his compliments sometimes felt like comparisons I hadn't agreed to. The way he'd reassure me while subtly making decisions without my input. None of it was explosive. That was the problem. It was quiet, steady, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. I thought about my age, 62. I had lived through enough to know that love doesn't erase respect. That partnership isn't about feeling small. Yet somehow I had allowed myself to excuse moments that didn't sit right. One evening, while folding laundry, I found myself holding one of his shirts, my fingers tracing the fabric absent-mindedly. I remembered a time when wearing his clothes made me feel close to him. Now, it felt like holding evidence. He walked by and kissed the top of my head. A sweet gesture, familiar, but something about the timing felt off, like it was meant to smooth over something I hadn't named yet. I smiled anyway. Inside, my thoughts were busy rearranging memories, fitting them into a new shape. Not to punish myself, not to rewrite history, just to understand it honestly. I remember my sister asking me once if I ever felt talked down to. I had laughed it off, defending him without hesitation. I wondered now if she had seen something I hadn't been ready to face. At night, I lay awake again, listening to his breathing beside me. The steady rise and fall, the comfort of routine, mixed with the ache of awareness. I wasn't angry yet. Anger requires certainty. I was still gathering pieces. But one thing was clear. The man I thought I knew had layers he never intended to share with me. And the gestures I once ignored had begun to speak louder than his words. I didn't know where this realization would lead. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't confronting him. Not yet. For now, I was simply allowing myself to see. And once you truly see, there's no going back. I had spent the entire morning replaying the gestures, the subtle signs, the small expressions I had once dismissed. Each movement of his fingers, each flick of his wrist, now carried weight. I realized that my focus had shifted from being attentive for love to being alert for truth. And in that shift, I found a strange, uncomfortable power. It began that afternoon while Mark was in the study typing away on his laptop. I lingered near the doorway, pretending to organize some books on the shelf. But my eyes never left him. His fingers danced across the keyboard with a rhythm that had always fascinated me. He didn't look up. He didn't notice me standing there. And then, almost casually, his hands moved into a gesture I had come to recognize, a gesture that once seemed harmless but now resonated sharply in my mind. I froze, not because I hadn't seen it before. I froze because I understood it completely. And with that understanding came the flood of realization. He thought I hadn't learned, that I was still clueless. He didn't know that every hand motion, every subtle sign he made, was now being interpreted, analyzed, and remembered. He didn't know I was listening. Really listening. I stepped back, silently, retreating into the hallway, letting the books fall back into place with a soft thud. The sound seemed louder than necessary, but he didn't look up. That confidence, that casual arrogance, had always been part of his charm. And now, it was part of what I had learned to read, to unravel. I understood that it wasn't charm, it was a shield, a mask, a carefully cultivated act that hid something darker beneath. That evening, while preparing dinner, I noticed it again. He stood near the stove, stirring a sauce, and his fingers moved in that same subtle rhythm. This time, I allowed myself to engage fully. I observed his expressions, the tilt of his head, the tension in his jaw, the brief flash of amusement in his eyes as he looked at me while thinking I was unaware. He had no idea that I now knew the difference between a gesture of affection and a gesture of deception. No idea that I could read the layers beneath his body language. I remembered a moment from last week when we were at the bookstore. He had been laughing quietly at something on his phone, standing a few feet from me. He made a series of gestures, swift, small, almost imperceptible to anyone else. I had assumed then that it was nothing, but now, looking back, each sign had been deliberate, each movement a message meant to pass unseen. And now I could decode them all. That night, while folding laundry in the bedroom, I noticed his hand brushing past mine, brushing past the stack of clothes in a motion that was supposed to be casual. I stopped and looked at him. He caught my gaze and smiled, thinking nothing of it. But I didn't smile back. I just watched. And in that watching, I realized how much power comes from attention, from silent observation. I realized that for years I had overlooked what was right in front of me, and now I would not. The next day, I decided to test the boundaries of my new awareness. I watched him as he called Alan. The friend I had long suspected was more involved than he admitted. His gestures were quick, deliberate, precise. I caught every nuance, every flick of his hand, every tilt of his head. He thought I was unaware, but I wasn't. I could see the subtle contempt in his movements, the faint amusement as he talked about things that didn't include me, things that were meant to be hidden. And I noted it all, storing it quietly, carefully, without letting a word slip. During dinner that night, he complimented me casually, a practiced charm I had once accepted without question. "You've been busy today," he said, sliding the plate of food toward me. His hands brushed the table lightly, almost to emphasize his point. I nodded politely, placing my fork down gently, all the while noting the micro-expressions he had no idea I was analyzing. The small curl of his lip, the subtle shift of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, it all spoke a language I now understood, fluently. I realized that the more I watched, the more I noticed patterns. Every smile, every casual touch, every word had layers. And with each observation, I saw more clearly the divide between the man I thought I knew and the man he allowed the world to see. I began to notice that he had a rhythm, a method to his gestures, a consistent subtlety that meant I could predict his intentions before they were even fully formed. It was eerie how predictable he had become, and yet I felt a growing sense of control because of it. The next morning, I sat quietly in the living room watching him pour coffee. He hummed softly to himself, the sunlight catching the tips of his hair, and for a brief moment, he looked entirely ordinary. And then he signed something again, a small, deliberate motion with a flick of his wrist that made my heart tighten. He was speaking without words, confident that I wouldn't notice, and yet I was fully aware. I smiled inwardly, a subtle victory that he couldn't see, couldn't comprehend. Throughout the week, I found myself observing him in ways I hadn't before. When he reached for the mail, I noticed the subtle way he hesitated, just enough to ensure no one else noticed the glance he cast toward the hallway. When he watered the plants, the tilt of his fingers and the faint shrug of his shoulders revealed more than words ever could. I began to realize that in paying attention, in truly listening, I was not only learning his gestures but also mapping his intentions, his private world that he believed was safe from me. One evening, I decided to attend a small local event at the community center, ostensibly to meet other people interested in sign language. I brought along my notebook, not for study, but for observation. Mark accompanied me, unaware of the silent game unfolding between us. In the crowded room, he moved among the attendees, chatting, smiling, gesturing. I noticed how he subtly positioned himself in conversations, always leading, always drawing attention in ways that made him appear generous while keeping the edge of control hidden. Each flick of his hand, each nod, each small motion was a story in itself, and I could read every one of them. As the night progressed, I caught him signing to someone in a way that I hadn't yet documented. Quick, almost casual, as if the person across from him was the only witness in the world. He didn't see me watch. I noted the expression, the motion, the intent behind the gesture. I realized that every day I was cataloging him in ways he had no idea were possible. I was silent, observant, and I held a power that had nothing to do with confrontation, only awareness. The following morning, while preparing breakfast, he tried to joke about a minor mistake I had made in the kitchen. His hands moved, emphasizing his words, playful gestures meant to amuse. I paused mid-cutting an apple, noticing how each sign layered meaning over the spoken words. I realized he had always relied on these movements to express nuances without explaining himself fully. Now, every nuance was clear to me, and in understanding, I found a quiet sense of revenge, not one of confrontation, but of comprehension. One afternoon, I visited Mrs. Donnelly again. She noticed my distracted demeanor. I explained vaguely that I had been thinking about communication, paying attention in new ways. She nodded knowingly, signing slowly, "Sometimes you see more than people expect." That simple gesture, filled with wisdom, resonated deeply. It reminded me that listening closely isn't just about noticing. It's about interpreting, understanding, and reclaiming your own sense of agency. By the weekend, I had begun small experiments, quietly adjusting my reactions to Mark. When he made a playful gesture, I responded subtly, acknowledging it in a way that suggested understanding without giving anything away. When he tried to distract me with conversation, I pretended to be absorbed in a book, but watched him with complete awareness. The balance of power had shifted imperceptibly, and it gave me a strange comfort. One evening, he suggested we watch a movie. I agreed, sitting next to him on the couch. Halfway through, he signed something quietly, a small motion he thought would pass unnoticed. I smiled softly, almost imperceptibly, letting him think he had succeeded. He didn't notice, and that small, secret victory filled me with a quiet satisfaction I had never expected. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was mine, and it was enough. As days turned into weeks, my attention sharpened. I noticed patterns in his laughter, gestures, and expressions. I observed how he interacted with neighbors, how he subtly curated impressions, how he maintained a calm exterior while manipulating small details around him. Each observation was a revelation, an uncovering of his personality that had been hidden behind charm and routine. I realized that by listening, by observing, by paying attention, I had created a map of him that he could not control. At night, as I lay in bed beside him, I watched him sleep. The rise and fall of his chest, the occasional twitch of his fingers, the subtle smile that crossed his face in dreams. It all became meaningful. Each tiny movement told a story I had never been able to read before. And in that quiet vigilance, I felt a sense of power and clarity that was almost intoxicating. I understood that what he didn't know was that I was listening closely, not just for words, not just for gestures, but for truth. And in that listening, I found not only awareness, but also a renewed sense of self. For the first time in years, I felt in control, not through confrontation or anger, but through understanding, through seeing clearly the man I had once trusted without question. And in that understanding, I began to recognize the possibilities of what could come next, knowing that every motion he made, every subtle sign, was now within my comprehension. I could choose how to respond. I could choose my moment. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like the author of my own story. For weeks, I had been observing, collecting, piecing together the hidden map of Mark's intentions, his gestures, and his carefully constructed facades. Every movement, every glance, every subtle sign was cataloged in my mind like pages in a secret diary he had never imagined I could read. And now, the time had come, not for a confrontation fueled by anger, but for something far more deliberate, quiet, precise revenge that he would never see coming. It began subtly, in ways that seemed almost ordinary to anyone watching. I smiled more often, but differently. My smiles were measured, filled with warmth on the surface, yet underneath I carried the knowledge of every betrayal, every dismissive flick of his hand, every sarcastic grin he thought I hadn't noticed. It was a small shift in tone, a change so subtle that he didn't question it at first. To him, it appeared I had forgiven or remained oblivious. To me, it was the beginning of reclaiming control. The first act of quiet revenge was personal. I had arranged the apartment meticulously, the way I knew he disliked, not in a dramatic, loud way, nothing that would alert the neighbors or friends, but small, deliberate tweaks. I moved his favorite coffee mug to a higher shelf. I placed the remote in a spot he would have to search for. I organized books on the shelf in a way that forced him to pay attention. Each minor inconvenience was invisible to anyone else, but carried weight in our shared space, a silent reminder that I was no longer as passive as I had once been. He noticed, eventually, of course. He would reach for his mug, pause, frown ever so slightly, and mutter a name under his breath. But he didn't accuse me, not openly, and that silence, that hesitation, told me I had unsettled him without a single word. I realized then that power didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it was quieter than a whisper, and yet heavier than a shout. Next, I used my newfound understanding of his gestures. Mark relied heavily on sign language with his friends, assuming I couldn't read him. One evening, while he was texting Alan and making his usual subtle hand signs, I let myself respond, not aloud, not directly, but in my own silent, invisible way. I mimicked the casual gestures back while pretending to do something else. The briefest, smallest reflection of his movements. He didn't notice, but I could see the slight twitch in his fingers as he checked his phone, a micro-expression I had learned to read. That tiny, imperceptible reaction felt like a victory. I also began leaving traces of my attention everywhere. Notes tucked into corners, simple things that Mark would see but not necessarily understand as messages from me. A folded napkin in the kitchen with a single word carefully printed, observe. A book opened on the living room table to a page he would glance at. Subtle signs that I was aware. Subtle signs that the game had changed. One Saturday morning, while he was in the shower, I took the time to sort through his old emails on his laptop. I didn't read everything. I didn't need to, but I looked for patterns, for small hints of arrogance or deceit. I found minor examples, the kind of messages most would dismiss, but I noted them mentally, Each one became a breadcrumb on the path I was now walking. When he emerged, wrapped in a towel, he greeted me with his usual charm. I returned the smile. Inside, I counted victories silently. The most satisfying part of this quiet revenge, however, came when I realized how easily he underestimated me. Mark had always relied on the assumption that I would not notice the nuances, the hidden layers, the unsaid words. And because he underestimated me, I was free to orchestrate small ripples that he would never connect back to me. It was the subtlety, the invisible nature of it, that made it effective. He thought he was untouchable. I knew otherwise. One afternoon, we had friends over for tea. Mark moved through the room with practiced ease, laughing, gesturing, appearing charming. I watched closely. Every time he made a subtle sign to signal inside jokes, I returned a smile or a nod that mirrored his movements, unnoticed by anyone else. It was as if I were dancing in the shadows of his own performance. And for the first time, I felt a private satisfaction that was deeper than anger or resentment. It was control. I began paying attention to the patterns in his speech as well, his choice of words in combination with gestures. If he emphasized something with a small flick of the wrist, I noted it. If his eyebrows twitched during a joke, I cataloged it. These details allowed me to anticipate his actions, to predict the subtle manipulations he would attempt. And in predicting them, I realized I was no longer his passive audience. I was a participant in the silent game, and I was now leading without anyone realizing it. My quiet revenge also extended to our shared plans for the wedding. While outwardly I participated in decision-making, I carefully guided the logistics to my advantage. Small delays, subtle changes, adjustments that Mark didn't notice, all ensured that the control he thought he held was now balanced by my influence. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't confrontational. But it was deliberate. And each night when I lay in bed, I felt the weight of this quiet victory settle into my chest like a warm ember. I discovered that quiet revenge requires patience. I didn't rush. I didn't act on impulse. Every small act was calculated, thoughtful, and almost invisible. I started noticing how often Mark assumed outcomes without considering my perspective. And that assumption, which had once left me feeling powerless, was now my advantage. By appearing compliant, appearing unconcerned, I allowed him to reveal his true nature repeatedly, each time confirming my understanding and reinforcing the power I had quietly amassed. One evening, as he was reviewing some wedding invitations at the dining table, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down nearby. I watched as he signed briefly to Alan on the phone, smiling as he thought he was unobserved. I let a soft sigh escape my lips, barely audible, and he looked up. "What?" he asked casually. I shook my head, pretending to be thoughtful. "Nothing," I said, but inside I savored the moment. I knew he felt a flicker of curiosity, a subtle unease that I had carefully planted. I also began using his underestimation to my advantage in public. On a Sunday walk in the park, when he attempted to show me off to neighbors with a few casual signs, I responded in ways that appeared innocent, but subtly mirrored his gestures in unexpected ways. No one else noticed, but I did, and each silent echo of his movements reminded me that the rules of engagement had changed. He was no longer the one in complete control. The quietest, most satisfying moments came when he tried to manipulate my emotions. I had once reacted instantly, laughing at his jokes, apologizing for minor errors, smoothing over his carelessness. Now, I responded with calm, deliberate neutrality. His attempts to provoke a reaction fell flat. He signed, he gestured, he tried to nudge, and I simply observed. The frustration built quietly in him, unseen by anyone else, but I felt it radiate like heat across the room. And I savored that in silence. I even started documenting his movements and patterns in a small notebook. Each page contained subtle observations, a record of gestures, timing, and context. It was private, meticulous, and obsessive in the best sense. Not for revenge in the dramatic, confrontational way, but as a tool, a map of understanding. And every time I added a new observation, I felt a sense of security I hadn't known I needed. He thought he had a map of me. I had a map of him, and it was more detailed, more accurate, and infinitely more useful. As days turned into weeks, my confidence grew. I realized that Mark had never expected me to develop this awareness, this ability to see beneath the surface. And because he hadn't expected it, he never prepared for it. Every subtle smirk, every casual hand motion, every small attempt at control was now mine to interpret, to counter, to manage. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to confront him. I simply needed to exist fully aware, letting the tiny shifts in behavior accumulate into something undeniable. One night, while we were watching a movie, Mark signed a small, playful message to me, thinking I was oblivious. I paused, my eyes locking on his hands. And then, in a motion so small it could have been mistaken for adjusting my sleeve, I mirrored his gesture perfectly. His smile faltered, just slightly. He didn't understand. He never would. And that tiny ripple of recognition, or rather the absence of it, was more satisfying than any dramatic confrontation I could have imagined. By the end of the month, I noticed subtle changes in him. Not anything overt, but shifts, hesitations, a fraction of doubt creeping into movements that had once been completely confident. I didn't need him to speak. I didn't need him to apologize. He was adjusting to my awareness, even if he didn't realize it. And every day as I carried out my ordinary routines, folding laundry, cooking, running errands, those silent acts of revenge continued. I realized something important during this process. Revenge didn't have to be explosive to be effective. It could be quiet, patient, and meticulous. It could be woven into the everyday. It could be invisible, and yet leave a mark that no one else would ever see. I didn't need to embarrass him, humiliate him, or confront him in public. My quiet, persistent attention, my deliberate observation, my control of the small details had shifted the balance of power without a single word raised. And so I continued. Each day, each subtle movement, each mirrored gesture, each small rearrangement of space became my revenge. Quiet, invisible, but undeniable. Mark moved through the apartment, through our lives, assuming he was in control. But the truth was simple. What he didn't know was that I was fully aware, fully present, fully in command of myself, and quietly of the space he had long believed he dominated. The quiet revenge he never saw coming wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming agency, dignity, and self-respect. It was about transforming years of unnoticed moments into a tapestry of awareness and deliberate action. And in that quiet, measured reclamation of my life, I found a satisfaction deeper than any confrontation could have offered, a calm, unshakable strength that he could neither take from me nor ever truly understand. I remember the morning I decided to leave as if it had been etched into my memory with fire. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, bright and unapologetic, highlighting the ordinary beauty of the house I had once thought would hold a lifetime of happiness. But I knew it no longer could. I didn't need a dramatic confrontation. No shouting, no raised voices. I only needed to claim the one thing he had tried to hide from me, my own voice. I had spent weeks silently observing, quietly cataloging his gestures, his manipulations, the subtle ways he had belittled me without a single word. I had learned to read him, to anticipate his motions, to see his unspoken thoughts. And in learning, I had found clarity, courage, and most importantly, peace. That morning, the decision came naturally. It wasn't sudden, but it was final. Mark was at the stove, humming softly as he poured coffee. I pretended to pour myself a cup, but my hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with anticipation. I had rehearsed the moment over and over in my mind. How I would remain calm, how I would choose words carefully, how I would walk away with dignity intact. "Morning," he said casually, sliding the mug toward me. He smiled, a habit I had once adored. "Morning," I replied, my voice steady. I placed the mug down without touching his. I didn't flinch. I didn't apologize. That was the first victory, the absence of submission. He sipped his coffee, glancing at me sideways, as if measuring my mood. "You seem different," he said. I tilted my head slightly, a soft, almost imperceptible smile on my lips. "I suppose I am," I said, not arrogant, not bitter, just honest. Mark nodded, confused, as if trying to decode my calmness. I had learned over weeks that he relied on assumptions. He assumed I would react, that I would plead, that I would beg for his approval. I didn't, and that unnerved him, though he didn't yet know why. I finished my tea, set the mug in the sink, and walked toward the bedroom to gather a few things. He watched me silently, probably thinking I was heading out to run errands, or maybe just organizing. I allowed him that illusion, let him think he was still in control. That, too, was part of the quiet power I had claimed. Packing was methodical, calm, not dramatic. I didn't throw things across the room. I didn't slam drawers. Each item I folded and placed into my bag felt like a tangible reclaiming of my life. My wedding dress, which had hung untouched in the spare room, I left behind. I didn't need it. Not anymore. It was not a loss, but a reminder of the life I had almost surrendered. And now, the life I would take back for myself. Mark finally spoke when I zipped up my bag. "Where are you going?" I turned to face him, calm, collected, with a weight behind my eyes that I knew he would feel, even if he couldn't name it. "I'm leaving," I said. "I need to live in a space where I can breathe, where my voice is mine. I can't do that here." He blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Vivian, you can't just—" "Watch me," I interrupted softly. The words weren't meant to wound. They were meant to assert, to define boundaries that had been ignored for too long. He opened his mouth again, as if to argue, but I didn't wait. I walked toward the door. The apartment felt silent, yet every detail I had once overlooked now seemed amplified. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant chirping of birds outside, the weight of years of compromises I had silently carried. I felt them lift from my shoulders with each step. Outside, the air was crisp. I inhaled deeply, letting it fill my lungs in a way I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. The city around me was ordinary, cars moving, neighbors walking dogs, the low hum of life. But for me, it felt extraordinary. It was the first morning I had truly arrived at myself in a long time. Mark didn't follow immediately. I could see him through the window, standing in the kitchen doorway, watching. Confusion, mixed with something that resembled panic, flickered across his face. He had assumed, until now, that I would always stay, that I would always forgive, that I would always bend. He hadn't anticipated that I would recognize the truth and act on it. That was my quiet victory. The walk to my car was slow, deliberate. I didn't rush. I noticed the subtle warmth of the sun on my shoulders, the faint scent of blooming flowers from a neighbor's garden. Each step was a testament to the life I was claiming, to the power I had regained simply by choosing myself. Driving away, I didn't glance back. I didn't need to. The house, the street, the life I had almost surrendered, all of it was now behind me. I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in decades. Every gesture Mark had made, every manipulation, every dismissive comment, all of it had led me here. And I walked away not bitter, not angry, but free. For the first time, I thought about the future in my own terms. I pictured small routines, quiet mornings, evenings spent in spaces I chose. I thought about reconnecting with friends I had neglected, pursuing hobbies that had been sidelined, and enjoying moments of solitude without fear. The idea of freedom was intoxicating, more vibrant than I could have imagined when I was still living in his shadow. At a stoplight, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked older than they had in years, yes, but they were alive, clear, certain. I realized that Mark had never actually held power over me. He had only held my silence. And now, that silence was gone. My voice, once restrained, was finally intact. When I reached a small cafe near the edge of town, I parked and sat inside for a while. I ordered tea, and as I waited, I watched the people around me, strangers, families, couples, and realized how many times I had measured myself against someone else's expectations. How many years I had lived quietly to accommodate someone else's whims, someone else's hidden truths. And now, none of that mattered. I was my own measure, and it felt like sunlight after decades of overcast skies. Later that day, I called my sister. Hearing her voice, warm and familiar, made the weight of the past weeks lift even further. "Vivian, where have you been?" she exclaimed. I laughed softly. "I've been finding myself," I said. We spoke for hours. She hadn't known about the full extent of Mark's behavior. She listened, gasped quietly at moments, and then, without judgment, she encouraged me to take the steps I had been hesitant to take. It was the first time in a long while that I felt my choices were fully supported. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I sat on the porch of my sister's home, sipping tea and letting the wind carry away lingering fears. I thought about Mark, not with anger, not with revenge, but with clarity. I recognized that staying with him would have cost me my dignity, my voice, my peace. Walking away was not abandonment, it was preservation. And in that realization, I felt something profound. Strength. Days turned into weeks, and each morning I woke up with a sense of possibility. I walked through the grocery store without glancing at familiar aisles I had once avoided. I revisited local parks I hadn't entered in years. I took small trips on my own, enjoying quiet solitude without fear of judgment. And every time, I felt the freedom that comes from walking away, not from a loud confrontation, but from a deliberate reclaiming of oneself. One afternoon, I visited a small community center that offered sign language workshops. I had started this journey months earlier, quietly, privately, but now I attended openly. I shared what I had learned with new friends, laughed in class, and felt the joy of language as a tool for connection rather than manipulation. It was symbolic, perhaps, that the skill Mark had assumed I couldn't use became the very instrument of my empowerment. I thought about the moments I had tolerated, the small gestures, the dismissals, the hidden signs. Each had been part of a pattern I had once ignored. But now, I recognized them as lessons, steps that guided me toward awareness. And every step, no matter how painful, had brought me to the point where I could leave with my voice intact. There were moments of doubt, of course, moments when I wondered if I had overreacted, if I had misread his intentions, if walking away was truly necessary. But then I would recall the gestures, the subtle signs, the micro-expressions I had cataloged over weeks. I would remember how he had assumed ignorance, how he had underestimated me. And I would find reassurance in the clarity I had gained. One evening, while sipping tea by the window, I noticed a small bird perched on the railing. Its feathers ruffled gently by the wind. It chirped softly, as if acknowledging the quiet power of simply being. I smiled. that bird, unaware of its own presence, reminded me of myself, finally free, finally seen, finally aware of the power of a voice restored. By the time weeks had passed, I had established routines that reflected my independence. I volunteered at the library, attended social gatherings, and rekindled relationships I had put aside. Each interaction, each choice was guided by my own values, not the expectations or manipulations of another. And with each passing day, I realized how deeply satisfying it was to live authentically, to speak, to move, and to act without fear. Walking away had not been easy. There were moments of sadness, of longing, of imagining what might have been. But those moments were fleeting. Each was countered by the overwhelming sense of control, of ownership over my own life. I had learned a lesson few realize until it's almost too late, that true courage is not in confrontation, but in choosing oneself. Late one evening, I sat on the porch once again, a cup of tea in hand. The wind whispered softly through the trees, carrying scents of flowers and distant rain. I thought about Mark, the life I had left behind, the lessons I had learned, and the voice I had reclaimed. I whispered to the quiet night, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in gratitude to myself. I see now, I hear now, and I will never be silent again. And in that moment, I understood something vital. Walking away with my voice intact was more than escape. It was survival, dignity, empowerment. It was the affirmation that I could stand alone, not because I had to, but because I had earned it. The freedom of awareness, the joy of autonomy, and the strength of reclaiming one's own narrative, these were gifts I had long overlooked, and now they were mine, fully, without compromise. As the night deepened, I realized that freedom had a quiet sound. Not a shout, not a slam of doors, not a declaration to the world. It was the soft, persistent heartbeat of a life taken back, a voice no longer silenced, a soul no longer constrained. And I felt, for the first time in decades, entirely whole. Walking away had not been an act of escape. It had been an act of reclamation. My voice was intact. My spirit was free. And the world felt like an open road, bright and full of possibility. I smiled into the night, knowing that whatever came next, I would face it fully aware, fully heard, and fully alive. Sitting on the porch that evening, the last traces of sunlight spilling across the horizon, I let myself finally breathe without restraint. The house behind me, the life I had known with Mark, faded into a memory that no longer held power over me. I had walked away not with anger as my guide, not with a desire for punishment, but with the clarity that comes from truly knowing oneself. For years, I had silenced my own voice to accommodate his gestures, his expectations, his whims, never realizing that my quiet compliance had been the very tool of my imprisonment. Now, every sound I made, every movement I took was mine to claim. The air itself seemed to hum with possibility, as if the world had shifted slightly just to make room for me. I could feel it in the weightless way my shoulders dropped, the way my chest expanded with each deep inhale. For the first time in decades, I wasn't hiding behind smiles, silences, or politeness. I wasn't measuring my words to avoid conflict, nor was I shrinking myself to fit someone else's comfort. I was present, fully, entirely, unapologetically. I thought about the small acts that had led me here, the gestures I had once ignored, the fleeting signs I had dismissed, the quiet moments that now, in retrospect, told their truth. Each had been a clue, a guide, a step toward awareness that I had been too inexperienced or too trusting to recognize before. And yet, in learning to observe without judgment, to understand without confrontation, I had found something stronger than anger. I had found resilience. I had found agency. I had found my voice. Not just a voice to speak out loud, but a voice that lived in my actions, in my choices, in the way I carried myself through the world. It was a voice that could not be silenced, a voice that could not be ignored, a voice that had been buried only temporarily, waiting for me to claim it fully. And as I watched the soft glow of streetlights flicker on in the distance, I realized that walking away wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. It was the first day of a life unbound by manipulation, unshadowed by deceit, untethered from the constraints of someone else's perception of me. I had chosen solitude, not as loneliness, but as freedom. I had chosen clarity over confusion, awareness over ignorance, and courage over fear. The lessons I had learned from Mark, from the years of subtle betrayals, from the quiet manipulations that had once left me questioning my own worth, were no longer chains. They were tools. They were the blueprint of survival and self-respect that I would carry forward into every conversation, every relationship, every decision I made from this day onward. For the first time, I felt the profound satisfaction of living for myself alone, unafraid to be seen, unafraid to speak, unafraid to act. And in that freedom, I knew the truth that had eluded me for far too long. Strength isn't loud, and power isn't always dramatic. Sometimes strength is quiet, patient, and deliberate. Sometimes power is simply the courage to reclaim your own life, to honor your own instincts, and to walk away with your voice intact. And in that moment, as the night embraced me and the world around me continued in its ordinary, chaotic rhythm, I felt complete, whole, free, and utterly gloriously alive.